Just to give us the geographic context, when we talk about Abou-Simbel, the two temples there for Ramesses and Nefertari, technically we are not in Egypt. We are here, which is in lower or northern Nubia, a region which the Egyptians called Wawat. Now, right at the top of this map, we have Aswan or Elephantine, which is at the first cataract of the Nile. The cataracts are these sort of rocky rapids that emerge from the waterway at various points along the Nile. There's about 5 of them within Nubia, and the Egyptians ruled during the New Kingdom. They controlled up to the first 4. But basically from Aswan or Elephantine, that was where officially Nubia kind of started as far as the Egyptians were concerned. So today, the borders of modern Egypt and Sudan, they meet just south of Abu Simbel. But in antiquity, Abu Simbel is very much in Nubia. And historians call this and other temples here the Nubian temples of the pharaohs. So I think geographically, that's a really good thing to keep in mind, is that technically this is not a temple in Egypt. It is a temple in Nubia, and that feeds into part of what Ramesses is trying to achieve here. This is a reconstruction of what the temple would have looked like originally. Today, of course, all of the paint on the exterior is lost. I believe there are tiny traces here and there on the larger statues, like on the headdresses, very faint. But this is how, based on other Egyptian monuments and the color schemes which they tend to use. But this kind of gives you an idea of, within the physical landscape, this thing is really supposed to pop. Like it's, as you're sailing down or up the river, you're really supposed to catch it visually. The physical design of the temple of Abu Simbel is basically an inverted version of your classic Egyptian temple. So we have the classic one from Ramesses II, which is Luxor Temple. This pylon and these statues were erected in the reign of Ramesses II, although probably his father Seti actually started it. Anyway, the pylons are supposed to look like this. There is meant to be a giant lintel linking the two pylons. And depending on the alignment of the temple itself, Luxor is facing the wrong direction, but usually an Egyptian temple will be aligned east to west so that the sun can rise between the pylons at either at a solstice or at a specific date on which the temple was aligned. Abu Simbel actually does imitate that. It has the pylon shape, although you might not know it at a glance. And it has this figure of the sun god Ra in the very center to demarcate the sort of connection point between the two pylons. And as I said, those pylons are supposed to have the sun rise in between them on certain occasions. Ramesses carves that in stone when him or his priests are designing the entrance to Abu Simbel. Now that figure of Ra himself is actually quite interesting, just for a fun little kind of hieroglyphs code, if you will. We see the figure of Ra emerging from the rock, looking as he should do, as the Lord of all creation, very muscular, very trim, very strong. But he's clutching 2 little symbols in his left and right hand. On his right, our left, he's clutching the symbol Osir, which means power and strength. It's where we get the name Osir or Osiris. In his left hand, he is clutching a figure of the goddess Ma'at with her distinctive little feather that she wears atop her head. And she is the goddess of justice, truth, or the divine cosmic order, as it were, the way reality is supposed to function. And then, of course, we have the sun disk at the very top and the figure of the god himself, which is Ra. And if you put these 3 together, you get Osir Ma'at Ra, which is the throne name of Ramesses II. It's something that he especially quite likes to do, where he will carve, or his priests or artists will design statues that physically encode his name into the statue itself. It's called a rebus, by scholars, I should say. Ramesses really loves doing this. He loves to have a statue that kind of spells out his name in the art. But naturally, since this temple is partly dedicated to him and the sun god Ra, he takes the opportunity to show the god, but also to literally encode himself into the image of Ra emerging from the rock. It's just fun. It's one of my favorite things about Ramesses' art, is that he likes to do this. It's cool. One thing to kind of bring this all together is that the two temples of Abou-Simbel, the little temple of Nefertari and Hathor, and the larger temple of Ramesses and Ra-Horakhti, etc., they are technically one temple complex, and it is called the House or Domain of Ramesses, the Beloved of Amun. This seems to be sort of Ramesses kind of creating a new sacred center in Nubia, dedicated to him, to other gods, and to Nefertari at this particular location. Within the large temple, we find there are 5 gods who are particularly emphasized. About a dozen or maybe a few dozen actually appear on the walls, but the main 5 are Ra-Horakhti, the Lord of the Sun, a god called Horus Mecha, which seems to be a local version of Horus for this region. The region itself is called Mecha, and Horus of Mecha seems to be one of the main figures in the sanctuary. Then, of course, we have Amun-Ra and Petit, and as I mentioned earlier, Ramesses himself, but Ramesses presenting himself as a new god, not just a Horus, not just a son of Ra, but literally Ramesses the god. So the temple is dedicated to 5 gods in particular. And then the small temple is much more focused, as it were. It's specifically devoted to a local version of Hathor called Hathor of Ibshek or Abshek, however you want to pronounce it, which seems to have been a small town somewhere in the vicinity, who apparently had their own version of Hathor, or at least a local Nubian goddess whom the Egyptians equated with Hathor, and then it's devoted to Nefertari herself. So what's the point of these specifically? Why is Abu-Simbel here? Abu-Simbel is one of 5 temples that Ramesses II and his officials build in Lower Nubia, or Wawat, during his reign. The earliest one is in the north at a site called Beit el-Wali, and that was actually started by his father Seti, but then taken over and finished by Ramesses. The other 3 are called Gef Hussein, Wadi Seboa, and Der. And you don't need to remember those, but just remember there's 5 temples overall. All of these temples present a very specific vision of Ramesses that is kind of artistically and symbolically or religiously linked. It's the image of Ramesses as a god, but specifically Ramesses who tramples and dominates all foreign lands. Now, why does he do this? Well, again, the key thing to remember is that these temples are built within the colonial territories of Nubia, which the Egyptians are ruling. So it seems that Ramesses II particularly felt the need or the desire to establish his sort of political domination over the region through the medium of temples and art. Now, it's not just temples, to be clear. Many of these temples or sanctuaries, they have priesthoods. They'll be connected with small towns or perhaps even fortresses that exist within those regions. So he's modifying, or he's adding to the colonial infrastructure, as it were. To simplify it very, very broadly and probably horrendously for an Egyptologist, he seems to be consolidating Egyptian rule within Nubia and really kind of strengthening the foundations of their colonial control, as it were. The Egyptians had a persistent, I don't want to say problem with Nubia, but at least a persistent anxiety about rebellion and being challenged in Nubia. They were particularly concerned about the kingdom of Kush, which went by different names, but would eventually rise as quite a serious power in the region. Throughout the 18th dynasty and the reign of Ramesses and his father, we find the Egyptian kings constantly going south into Nubia, either to, as they describe it, crush a rebellion, or to lead a military expedition to smite the Nubians and to establish their control. Now, why are they so interested in Nubia? Well, fundamentally, they want the land They want the wealth. They especially want the gold. The eastern hills of Nubia are particularly rich in gold and copper, and the Egyptians wanted to control that forever. By the time Ramesses II became king, they had been the great power in Nubia for a couple of hundred years at least. But during the late 18th dynasty and early 19th, so the time of Ramesses II roughly, we do find them sort of consolidating their control over the region, building new towns, building new fortresses, bringing settlers and slaves into Nubia. Like Ramesses II actually, one of Ramesses' officials leaves a wall carving at Abu Simbel where he describes how Ramesses had brought captives from Syria, the prisoners of war, into Nubia and settled them as part of his domain, his temple lands. Bearing in mind the sort of loaded nature of the term, they are literally colonizing Nubia quite intentionally with new people, new towns, new temples, in order to strengthen their control over the region. And Abou-Simbel is part of that process. It's part of that policy. That's not its only function, of course. It has the whole religious aspect, and it has, it's glorifying Ramesses and making sure he's always remembered. But it is part of this larger imperial project. And that's kind of important to remember with these temples, because yes, they are houses of the gods, but they are also expressions of political power and political policy. And the more that scholars are able to excavate in southern Egypt and Sudan, the more they can uncover aspects of these policies, the more information we get about how the Egyptians are interacting with the Nubians, dominating them, trading. And it's a really fun aspect of Egyptology. Fun's the wrong word. It's a really intriguing aspect of Egyptology is this phase of strengthening their rule and control while also consciously integrating new people and new populations into the region. That was kind of messy, but you get my point that Abou-Simbel is part of a much larger control and domination project. Now, I should stress that Ramesses did not make this idea up himself. He was not the first king to build new temples to himself as a god. The particular inspiration seems to have been Amenhotep III, who built temples for himself and his wife, Queen Tiye, at sites in Nubia called Soleb and Sedeinga. I'll probably do a live stream or presentation about New Kingdom Nubia properly at some point in the future. So you don't have to remember this, but the point is that Ramesses took something that an earlier king had started and built upon it. And Ramesses was really good at doing that. He didn't really rock the boat that much in terms of his policies, in terms of his ideas, but he took ideas that had been established with earlier generations and ratcheted them up to 11. That was kind of his great skill as a king, was solidifying what had already been done and expanding upon it in a really impressive way. So I mentioned that his statues actually have names. This is quite a common feature of his rule, is that many of his great statues, his colossal images, they have names. The 4 statues at Abou-Simbel originally they have names carved on their shoulders. The hieroglyphs that you can see on their shoulders, they give us the names of each of these statues. So they are Lord of the Two Lands, the Ra of the rulers, or the sun god of rulers, kind of like King of Kings, but a level higher. Beloved of Amun and beloved of Atum. These names of these 4 statues, you can also find them on other great statues built in Luxor, in Memphis or Mennefer, and also in Ramesses, in Ramesses' great city. So the 4 statues of Abou-Simbel are kind of magically, I guess, linked to other images of the king within Egypt and at different temples. So because of the way the ancient Egyptians viewed statues as kind of a living image or a body for a spirit or a deity, you can think of these statues as kind of being an incarnation of Ramesses himself. So when you make offerings to them, when you speak their name aloud, you give the memory or the spirit of Ramesses power, you nourish him in the next world. And during his own lifetime, the idea was that he has these giant statues of himself at different locations. people can bring offerings, people can worship the king or his image at these temples, and therefore guarantee his immortality. But they're all kind of linked and connected both through their name and through their appearance at different sacred sites. So Ramesses' temple continues operations at least for a few decades after his death. It is, a sanctuary for the king, but also for multiple gods. So the priests continue to operate there for several generations afterwards, although unfortunately we don't know much about them. But one of the cool things is that you'll find many of the great statues are actually covered in graffiti. Now, some of the graffiti is modern, depending on the quality. On this leg here, just next to where my mouse is, we have graffiti from the 19th century. But on the other statues and on some sections, we actually do have graffiti from earlier periods, including the first millennium BCE. And my favorite one is this. And it's an inscription, you can read it on your own time as you wish, left by Greek mercenaries serving a later Egyptian king, a ruler named Psamtik, who sent an expedition into Nubia, a military expedition to conquer, crack heads, bring back loot and plunder, that kind of thing. But it has this graffito, which references Greeks, Carians, and Phoenicians, giving a sense that Psamtik around, say, like 590 BCE, was employing a force of mercenaries from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean region as part of his military force. And this cool little cosmopolitan army happened to stop by Abou-Simbel, and they were super impressed with it, and they left their inscription on the statue of Ramesses II. I just think that's really fun and really cool, and I really like that. It even sort of says, we came to visit, who was leading the distinct contingents of the army, who was leading the Egyptians, who was leading the foreigners. And they also meant, or whoever's carving it on the statue actually mentions that he did the carving. There's no particular historical significance to this in terms of Ramesses, but I just really like this story. So I wanted to finish up with that. So yeah, that is everything I have to say about Ramesses II, his temple at Abou-Simbel for now. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, do drop them in the chat, and I'll cycle through in a moment and try to answer some of them. So yeah, if you're departing now, thank you so much for watching. Otherwise, I will hopefully see you next time.